Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod. It's the third of our extended episodes on the Synoptic Problem, and like the other two, it's a recording of a class that I gave recently in February 2010 at Duke University as part of my introduction to the New Testament. This one looks at the arguments for and against the existence of Q. I hope you enjoy it.
Shall we do... I'm slightly nervous about today's topic, because there's a couple of schools of thought about topics that are difficult to teach. One of the schools of thought is that it's nice teaching things that you've done loads of research on, because you've got all the facts at your fingertips, right? Another school of thought is, if it's something you've done a lot of research on, there's the danger that you're kind of lost in the maze yourself of all the data, and it's harder to simplify it. The reason that this particular class is a tough one for me is that I've written an entire book just on the topic of today's class, right? And even though I've written another book on the topic of all three of these classes, which is the introductory book I wrote one entire book on just the topic of what we're going to do over the next hour. So we've got to make sure that I can see the wood for the trees, haven't we? Yeah? So if I go off on one and start, getting particularly obsessed with a particular detail, just stop me, yeah? Just say, you're going off on one, Okay? Right, a little bit of review. The Synoptic Problem is the discussion of the similarities and differences in the Synoptic Gospels with a view to finding out what the connection between the Synoptics is, especially trying to work out where the direct or indirect links between the Gospels are. There are several different kinds of material: triple tradition, double tradition, special Matthew, special Luke. They're the main four. Triple tradition we looked at last time, and looked at the fact that most scholars think that the best explanation for the triple tradition material is that Mark is the first gospel, that Matthew and Luke copied out of Mark. And the modifications that Matthew and Luke make, for most scholars, is more plausible than the opposite idea that Mark is dependent on Matthew and Luke. But if the priority of Mark is the answer to that triple tradition material, it still leaves us with one big class of data, which is the double tradition material, about 200 or 250 verses of material that's found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. And you see, if Matthew and Luke, and this is a diagram of the two-source theory that you can see on the board. I'm recording this one again. I'm recording all of them via Lectopia, but just for these three classes, I'm editing them and putting them out on my ordinary NT pod feed, as well as the raw feed that you get. What I do is I edit out anything that I don't want the general public to hear. So it's amazing how much stuff has to go. What we're saying? Yeah, so two-source theory. So for the people who are listening, and people in this class that haven't made it, who are listening and not viewing, what I've written on the board is this typical diagram of the two-source theory, which has Mark and Q as the two sources for Matthew and Luke. Now, I'm going to do a brief footnote now, which I probably won't return to, but I want to cover and get out of the way now. Sometimes the two-source theory is called the four-source theory. And the four sources basically add to Mark and Q, M and L. So I've put on the board also M and L. They both get square boxes because they're hypothetical sources. Now, the person that came up with the four-source theory, that particular way of viewing this stuff, was a British scholar called B.H. Streeter. And he died in a plane crash, didn't he? 1937. It's awful, obviously, but it's a kind of a claim to fame, isn't it? Rather than just died of pneumonia or something, to die in a plane crash. I think one of the only New Testament scholars I know of who died in a plane crash, B.H. Streeter. And he's the person who came up with the four-source theory. So for him, the four sources were Mark, Q, M, and L. Now, I'm not going to talk much more about M and L, because M and L really, under any theory, could still be there. So under the Pharaoh Theory, which we'll explore in a little bit, you could still have an M and an L there as well. But I mention this now because sometimes the two-source theory is called the four-source theory, okay? But the key two are Mark and Q. Is that making sense? I'll go for it.
Actually, I'm a little confused.
Right. Yeah. The way that Streeter does it is like it is on the board there. It has a glorious simplicity to it, because if you think about the four kinds of gospel material we looked at, triple tradition, double tradition, special Matthew and special Luke, what Streeter essentially did is said, each one of those four kinds of materials got a source. Q for the double tradition, Mark for the triple tradition, M for special Matthew, and L for special Luke. So, yes, they're all pre-gospel sources, except one of them, Mark, is a gospel. So it is a little bit odd in that sense. And there is that, I mean, it's one of the reasons, I think, that the two-source theory remains so popular, is that it has a glorious simplicity about it. I don't mean that in a disparaging way at all. I mean, there's an elegance about it. And it's easy to teach. As I think I've alluded already, a lot of places in this, in fact, not just in this country, but in the world, when they teach the synoptic problem, you won't get any of the stuff we've had. They will simply teach you the two-source theory, and you will only meet the data insofar as you meet it as a solution to the problem. So you will get the two-source theory introduced as if that is the synoptic problem. I know this because I talk to people about it, and I ask them how they teach it. I look at New Testament introductory books, and I even look at people's online syllabuses online sometimes. And it's very rare to see people actually teaching the data first. But anyway, so that's the kind of Streeter sort of diagram with four sources, each one relating to one kind of material. But for our purposes, the key two are Mark and Q. Because M and L, they're only in one gospel anyway. M in Matthew, L in Luke, so they're not as important for our purposes for working out similarities and differences, if that makes sense. So, the idea of this document Q is that it explains the double tradition material. And the case for Q is, in many senses, a kind of a negative theory, because what it's trying to do is it's trying to say that it's impossible to draw a direct line from Matthew to Luke for the double tradition material. And given that it's impossible to draw a direct line from Matthew to Luke, they must have got this double tradition material from somewhere. So the Q theory becomes the natural corollary to the idea that there is all this agreement between Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark. It's particularly important to see this as a literary source, as a written source, because the agreement between Matthew and Luke in this double tradition material is really, really close. Sometimes it's 100%. Really, really close. Word after word, in great long strings together. And so it's not the kind of thing that Matthew and Luke could have independently got from oral tradition. If there isn't a literary link of some sort in the double tradition, then there's no literary link anywhere, because this is really close kind of agreement. Now, as I've alluded, it's a kind of a tough one for me, because and it's depending on how you look at it, it's either great news for you or bad news for you. It's great news for you because it could be that I'm right, in which case it's kind of exciting, because we're in the minority, and you get to kind of hear some of the latest stuff. It'd be awful if I'm completely wrong, and you've got this crazy British guy who is teaching you some half-cocked theory, you know, which the rest of the world doesn't yet accept. But then you can decide. That's the thing. I don't insist on you taking my view. In fact, quite often, some of the most enjoyable pieces for us to grade are the ones that take issue, as long as you've understood. Sometimes people do it just to be bloody-minded, but if you're doing it because you actually genuinely think that the Q theory makes better sense of the data than the theory that Luke knows Matthew, then that's great. Okay, so, but it's hard for me because, of course, I want to present fairly the case for the existence of Q before I try and give you some of the reasons why I think it doesn't exist. I think it would be completely unfair if I simply said, this is why I don't believe in Q, and off we go. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try and present the case for Q as fairly as I can. And I can't promise not to do a little sort of wink or a smile or something like that. But the great thing about that is that anyone listening on the audio won't get to see that. Number 3, arguments for Q. The Q theory originates with the attempt in the 19th century to try and find in the text somewhere something that was actually referred to by an early church father called Papias. Papias talks about the Logia that Matthew compiled. Logia is a Greek word meaning sayings, oracles, something like that. And Papias just mentioned this sentence, that Matthew composed these Logia in the Hebrew language. And so what a lot of 19th century scholars did is they said, well, where is this? Where is the Logia? And they went looking for it. And they noticed there was all this double tradition material that was just in Matthew and Luke. And since they were already coming to a view of something like mark and priority, they said, well, perhaps this sayings material that's in Matthew and Luke is the material that Papias referred to, the Logia material. And if you go back to the 19th century, you'll often find that scholars don't call it Q, they call it the Logia. And to this day in Germany, you'll find that they often call it Logienquelle, the saying source. It's still that Logia bit is their key in the way that the whole thing is framed. Now, the term Q, you'll want to know where that comes from, right? I mean, it's a brilliant letter. If any letter you could choose, probably the only one which would be better would be the letter Z, because that sounds really funky, doesn't it? But there's a good reason not to call it Z, which is that in British English, Z is called Z, yeah. And so that would be hopeless, because I'd be spending the whole thing talking about Z, or I'd be saying Z and feeling self-conscious. So Q is the next best letter for it, because Q is, I think, the second most funky letter of the alphabet, don't you think? Yeah? And that's why, in fiction, Q is the letter they choose, isn't it? Great Qs in fiction? Give me a couple. James Bond's the obvious one, yeah. Who played, for extra point, who played Q in the films? I think it's Richard Llewellyn, I think that was his name. Or was it Desmond? Thank you. Desmond Llewellyn. Desmond Llewellyn, brilliant. He was almost dead by the last one that he took part in, but he got replaced briefly by John Cleese. Do you remember John Cleese appears in 2 films as his underling? So that's good. What other famous Qs are there, fictional Qs? Anyone used to watch Star Trek Next Generation? There was a Q in that as well. And the thing is, when I'm feeling naughty, I can't help talking about this one as a third fictional Q. But I said that I wasn't going to be naughty, didn't I? And I was going to do it straight. So that's the last naughty comment, at least for now. So, why do people believe in the existence of Q? I've already said that it's partly a negative thing. They're trying to make sense of the fact you've got all of this double tradition material with close agreement when Matthew and Luke didn't know each other. So, why do people think that Matthew can't have known Luke or Luke can't have known Matthew? And usually it's framed in the latter term in terms of Luke's knowledge of Matthew. You know, that people think it's impossible that Luke could have known Matthew. And here are the standard reasons given. The first one is Luke's order. Luke's order of the double tradition, it's said, is inexplicable on the assumption that he was working with Matthew. He's disrupted Matthew's beautiful order, including Matthew's neat ordering of double tradition into 5 large blocks. And in particular, he's ruined Matthew's finest creation, the Sermon on the Mount. If there's one nutshell argument that people use against Q, it's this one. Luke would not have destroyed Matthew's beautiful order. And especially, it really galls people, the idea that Luke would have messed up the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is admired by people across history. And you don't even need to be a Christian or a Christian sympathizer to admire the Sermon on the Mount. Gandhi famously loved the Sermon on the Mount, thought it was one of the most brilliant pieces of religious and ethical literature ever produced. And so there's this feeling, given how wonderful the sermon is, can you really believe that Luke would have come along and massacred it? Because what happens in Luke's gospel is you do have a sermon in Luke 6, verses 20 and following. And in structure, it partly resembles Matthew's sermon. It begins with Beatitudes, like Matthew's does, and it ends with the parable of the 2 builders. So it's clearly the same sort of thing. But whereas Matthew's sermon goes on for 3 whole chapters, uninterrupted, you don't even get Jesus said. It's just one long monologue. In Luke's gospel, it's just 29 verses or so. and then much of the rest of the sermon appears later in the Gospel. People will say things like, for Luke to have done this, it's like he's unscrambled the egg. Reginald Fuller once said that Luke, if he's used Matthew, has unscrambled the egg with a vengeance, is the way he put it. Or Kummel said that Luke, to have done what he must have done if he knew Matthew, has basically scattered the ruins of Matthew's sermon to the four winds. And this sounds very implausible, doesn't it? And it's probably the most important argument you will get against Luke's use of Matthew. And if Luke can't be seen to have done this, if Luke can't be imagined to have destroyed Matthew's wonderful order, then you have to rely instead on the Q theory, because the Q theory would make much better sense of the data. So on the Q theory, Luke's order of double tradition is essentially Q's order. Luke simply sticks to the Q order, slots it in blocks. He does a little bit of Mark, then he does a bit of Q, and a little bit of L thrown in as well. But basically, the Q order is Luke's order. And then Matthew, who's a bit more creative, will kind of gather Q material together and slot it into useful context. And Matthew, as we'll see in a couple of weeks when we do Matthew's Gospel, has this wonderful 5-discourse structure. So he has 5 big kind of sermons, of which the Sermon on the Mount is the first. And people say, why would Luke have messed that up? So that's Luke's order. Possibly the most important argument, which is why I've put it first. There's always a debate, isn't there, about whether you should put your best argument first or whether you should save it till the end. But that's the best argument for Q. A second argument for the existence of Q is that Luke is ignorant of Matthew's additions to Mark. In other words, Matthew, when he is rewriting Mark on the assumption of Mark and priority, quite often adds little bits, expands the material. So things like the cornfield in the Sabbath story, Matthew's got a whole extra little section in the middle, which doesn't appear in Luke's version of the same story. Or Peter's walking on the water. When in Matthew's Gospel the story of the walking on the water appears, Peter walks on the water in the middle of the story. Or you have Jesus' commendation of Peter at Caesarea Philippi. This is when Jesus has asked Peter who people say he is, and Peter says, some say Elijah, some say John the Baptist, and some say one of the prophets. And Jesus says, who do you say I am? And he says, you are the Christ, the Son of God. And then in Matthew it goes on with Jesus saying, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And that whole extra new bit isn't in Luke's version of that story. In other words, if Luke knows Matthew's redactions of Mark, if Luke knows Matthew's version of Mark's Gospel, the way that Matthew wrote at Mark, why does Luke not include those expansions? And since Luke doesn't seem to know those expansions of Mark in triple tradition material, it's thought that Luke couldn't possibly have known Matthew. And therefore the double tradition material doesn't come from Matthew, it comes from Q. And this is also an argument that gets made a lot. The book, yeah. Whenever I'm saying Matthew, it's a shorthand for saying the book, but thank you, that's a useful clarification. Yeah. Nobody much thinks that the people actually knew one another, although I do love the idea that actually what happened is, in about 68 CE, Matthew, Mark and Luke, whose real names were, I don't know, Kevin, Timothy and Pete, were having a little sort of meeting, and they said, wouldn't it be fantastic if we just completely muck up the rest of theologians and biblical scholars' lives by all doing a little bit, and every rule that we can come up with, let's make sure that we break it somewhere, yeah? And there's one notorious pericope, one notorious passage in the Synoptics called the Beelzebub controversy, which has puzzled people, even the most brilliant synoptic scholars, for years. And I kind of like the idea that they conspired together to make the Beelzebub controversy pericope, just like tear your hair out type stuff. So, yeah, but I don't think that happened. I think what actually happened was they didn't know one another. They never met one another. But you couldn't rule it out. So that's the second argument for the existence of Q. Third argument for the existence of Q is that Luke is ignorant of Matthew's additions. Oh, I've just done that one, sorry. Third, you can put these in any order you want. The third argument is Luke is ignorant of the M material. That there's all this material in Matthew's Gospel, this new material, that Luke is apparently ignorant of. A good example given of this is the story of the Magi. Some of you who went home for the holidays will have participated in some kind of Christmas celebration of some sort. It's much bigger in the UK. Everyone in the UK celebrates Christmas, all the atheists. Even Richard Dawkins celebrates Christmas. And that's actually not a joke. That's actually, well, it's funny, but it's not a joke. In that he actually does. He loves Christmas carols. He actually was forced to admit it one day and say, "Come on, you must really." And he goes, "I know, I love Christmas carols." But he does. It's in an article in The Spectator. Seriously, have a look at it. But so everyone in Britain, in America, like, you know, it's kind of, only some people celebrate Christmas, right? And the atheists don't celebrate it so much, do they? Anyway, why am I saying this? Yeah, so the Magi. Yeah, so if you participate in one of those, like, Christmas nativity play type things, what are they called? Are they called pageants in America? Brilliant. Pageant is used for a number of different things in America, isn't it? Because, like, there's beauty pageants as well, isn't there? But it's different from that, yeah? So if you participate in one of those pageants, you get Magi, right? Usually 3 wise men or 3 kings, yeah? Well, in Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew chapter 2, they're called Magi, right? It's like the same word we get our sort of magic, that kind of thing, from. And these people are described as people coming from the east, and they clearly seem to be Gentiles. Now, Luke's Gospel, if you know anything about Luke, is thought to be the Gospel of the Gentiles. So Q theorists will say, surely, if Luke had known Matthew's Gospel, he would have used this wonderful story about the Magi. Because after all, Luke loves Gentiles. Why not have, at Jesus' birth, this first fruits of the Gentiles coming to worship Jesus, bringing him gold, frankincense, and myrrh? The fact that Luke doesn't have the Magi means, for Q theorists, that Luke cannot have known Matthew's Gospel. So Luke is ignorant of M material. And people that make this argument, they'll list a whole bunch of... Sorry, Luke is ignorant of M material. Did I just say Q then? I could really confuse you, couldn't I, just by tossing the wrong word in here and there. So Luke is ignorant of M material. And the Q theorists, they'll list a whole load of M material that Luke seems to be ignorant of. Not just the Magi, lots of other examples as well. Argument number 4. Are you persuaded yet? Very good arguments, these are. These arguments have been honed over decades, right? These have been kind of worked at by the finest minds in Germany, in Britain, in America, usually those 3 countries, and they are accepted by the vast majority of New Testament scholars to this day. These are the key arguments on which the whole Q edifice rests. And there's a 4th really, really important one, and it's the theory of alternating primitivity. The point of this argument is that sometimes Matthew and sometimes Luke has the more original form of a double tradition saying. So if Luke had known Matthew, Matthew's versions would always be primary and Luke's would always be secondary. But that doesn't appear to be the case. Sometimes Luke has a more primitive version and sometimes Matthew has a more primitive version. Of course, the cases where Matthew has a more primitive version aren't a problem for people that think Luke knew Matthew. But the cases where Luke apparently has an older version, that's a real problem for the idea Luke knew Matthew, isn't it? It's basically guesses, but it's a case of what people will do is they'll say, let's take the First Beatitude. In Matthew, the First Beatitude goes, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In Luke 6:20, it goes, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Now, what everyone says is, it makes much better sense that Luke's version is the oldest version, it's the more primitive version. because it's easier to imagine Matthew editing, redacting a version that says, blessed are the poor, by adding the little spiritualizing phrase, blessed are the poor in spirit, than it is to imagine the reverse, Luke changing blessed are the poor in spirit and making it much rawer with blessed are the poor. So that's the sort of rough idea. Or you take the Lord's Prayer, which occurs in Matthew 6 and Luke 11. Matthew's version is much more elaborate than Luke's. Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer is the one that's familiar to most Christians today. So if you pray the Lord's Prayer, or you've heard people pray the Lord's Prayer, it begins usually, Our Father in heaven, or Our Father who art in heaven, right? That's Matthew's introduction. In Luke, it's just the one word, Father. And there's other bits missing from Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer. Matthew's version is much fuller and more ornate, more elegant in many respects. So what Q theorists say is that it makes much better sense. What Q theorists say is it makes much better sense to see Luke's as the older version of the Lord's Prayer, the Q version, which Matthew has then kind of, so what should we say, has spiritualized it and made it more ornate and more elegant and so on. So Luke often has, for Q theorists, the more primitive version because Luke is copying out of Q on those occasions. And then Matthew secondarily builds up his version in his gospel. Does that make some sort of sense? So it's only theorizing. It's not, we don't actually have a source that we can compare these things with. Do you mean that it was like kind of crisscross? So that Luke read an early version of Matthew and then Matthew read another version of Luke, like that? It's not impossible. And in fact, Ed Sanders, in the Studying the Synoptic Gospels book, keeps open the possibility of what he calls crisscross copying, where you go through a succession of drafts where one earlier draft influences a later draft of another gospel, and that subsequently influences another version of that gospel. And to some extent, that definitely, in a small way at least, that definitely has happened, because we can look at the different texts of these going into the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, where things do change. So, for example, some scribes, and remember there's no printing presses or anything like this, so some scribes of Luke, when they get to the Lord's Prayer in chapter 11, they start copying down the Lord's Prayer, and they see this thing, Father, and they think, no, that's not the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer begins, Our Father who art in heaven. Everyone knows that. So they write, instead of writing Father, which is in the text in front of them, they write, Our Father who art in heaven. So that certainly does happen at least on the scribal level. It's an interesting question whether that same kind of thing could already be happening at the level of draft of the text. And certainly if it has happened, it does throw a spanner into the works. Is that a Britishism, spanner in the works? Give me an American. It means?
Throw a wrench.
Oh, throw a wrench. Okay. What do you throw a wrench into?
Same thing.
The works.
Throw a wrench in the system.
Wrench in the system, okay. Do you have spanners in America?
Call them wrenches.
Oh, okay. Is that what a wrench is it? I wasn't what a wrench was. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. I do love this. I mean, I've been here nearly 5 years now, and I'm still learning all about your fantastic culture. Okay, I think we're ready for the case against Q. Okay, here are my attempt to answer those points that were made in the case for Q. First of all, the question of Luke's order. Oh, I've changed the diagram on the board now. This is the Pharaoh Theory, which still has Mark and priority, where Mark is a source for Matthew and Luke, but it no longer has Q, because you have a direct line from Matthew to Luke. In other words, Luke takes the double tradition material directly from Matthew. The Pharaoh Theory is named after Austin Farrer, who was an Oxford theologian of the 1940s and 50s. He died in 1968, and one of his most famous students was called Michael Golder, and sadly he died about 3 weeks ago, in fact almost a month ago now. So, case against Q. The idea is that you can dispense with Q by drawing that direct line from Matthew to Luke. And so the arguments that it's impossible to draw such a line, I think are completely implausible. So to take the first of those ones, Luke's order. Remember that it said it's impossible that Luke could have destroyed Matthew's fine order. I think this is simply a value judgment. It's an artistic judgment about what people think Luke should have done rather than what he actually did. And when you start paying attention to Luke's practices with Mark, you find it quite plausible to see him doing the same kind of things with Matthew. So, for example, when you look at what Luke does with Mark chapter 4, Mark's parables chapter, you notice he does exactly the same thing that he does with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. He keeps some of it, he omits some of it, and he redistributes some of it. So what Luke does with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount is simply the same kind of thing that he does with Mark's Gospel when he's using Mark. I find this point exceptionally difficult to persuade people of because they are so wedded to the idea that Luke couldn't have messed up Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. So I tried an experiment about 10 years ago, which has had zero success in persuading my fellow scholars, but I'll try it with you anyway. I noticed that when people were making this argument about Luke's order, they were making basically an artistic judgment, a value judgment. They were saying they'd simply disliked what Luke must have done with Matthew's order if Luke had used Matthew. So I said, okay, let's have a look at what some other artists have done with Matthew's Sermon on the Mount across history. And let's take as our best current example Jesus films, because almost every Jesus film has the Sermon on the Mount in it. Do they all keep the Sermon on the Mount completely intact because it's the most beautiful piece of religious writing of all time? Not on your life, do they? They all do exactly what Luke did with it. They push it later in the narrative, they chop it in half, sometimes they chop it in a half or even a quarter, they move sayings around, they make it a little bit more lively. Even Pier Paolo Pasolini, he did a film called The Gospel According to St. Matthew. The name of the film is Matthew's Gospel. Do you know what he did with the Sermon on the Mount? Chopped it in half, moved it later in the Gospel, added a bit of liveliness to it. He did exactly what Luke does with it. And people then say, well, perhaps they were dependent on Luke then. And I say, well, point proved then. In that case, what Luke did, isn't that stupid, is it? I cannot get this point over. Do you know, there's a guy who actually wrote an article against my piece. Part of the problem is, I've got a slightly, what should we call it? I always want to do things that make me smile or make someone else smile. So I gave the article the title, The Synoptic Jesus and the Celluloid Christ, Solving the Synoptic Problem Through Film. And it was supposed to be lively and a little bit facetious, but with a serious point. But this guy wrote this article, a guy called F. Gerald Downing, in which he argued, well, what Goodacre doesn't understand is that 20th century cinema parallels are nowhere near as important as first century parallels. And I just thought, how do you answer that kind of thing? Well, what I did is I did an answer called On Choosing and Using Appropriate Analogies, which is all about how analogies work in academic argumentation, and that you have to distinguish between analogy and evidence. Lots of scholars don't know the difference between evidence and analogy, and sometimes analogy is a means of showing people how something that is in the evidence could have happened. But gosh, it's hard work persuading people of this one. People go, oh, Goodacre seems to think that films provide the answer. So what can you do? Anyway, that's my attempt at saying that people really shouldn't balk at what Luke must have done to Matthew. Luke doesn't like long discourses in his sources anyway. In Acts of the Apostles, which is Luke's second volume, someone actually falls out of a window because he's fallen asleep while Paul is preaching a long sermon. That's what Luke's attitude is to long discourses. Okay, it's Luke's order. B, Luke's ignorance of Matthew's additions to Mark. This argument is simply fallacious. The fact is that if Luke knows Matthew, he includes many of Matthew's additions to Mark. The temptation story is one really obvious example. It's 2 verses in Mark's Gospel. Matthew expands it right out to quite a lengthy piece in Matthew chapter 4, and Luke then, apparently, on the Pharaoh Theory, copies out the Matthean version. This quite often happens in Luke. So you might say, well, why do people say then that Luke doesn't do this? The reason that people say that Luke doesn't do this is that there's a whole special category for these kind of pieces of work, and it's called Mark-Q overlaps. So what the two-source theory does is it says every time there are major agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark, these are places where Mark and Q overlapped. Now, sometimes when I argue against Mark-Q overlaps, Q scholars will say, well, it's not remotely implausible that Mark and Q could have overlapped. Of course it's not implausible. But the point is, you can't make part of your argument that Luke never includes Matthew's additions to Mark if actually, on the Pharaoh Theory, he does. So this is another one which is a little bit of an effort to kind of get over, as it were. But the point, I think, is that as you survey the synopsis, there's a kind of continuum in the amount that Luke uses Matthew. There are those points where he uses Matthew very little. There's points where he is mainly dependent on Mark, and he only just has a few little minor agreements with Matthew. That's probably quite a lot of instances, but not all of them. You can never find a place where Luke has no agreements with Matthew. He always has some. So there's those cases. Then there are cases where Luke uses quite a bit of Matthew's additions to Mark, which Q scholars call Mark-Q overlaps. And then at the end of that continuum, you've got the places which are like pure Q, which is just Luke and Matthew. So I think that there's a continuum going across a sliding scale, if you like, of Matthean influence on Luke. And the only reason that people don't see it is because what they do is they divide up the data according to the dominant solution, the two-source theory. That's why I'm so big on not teaching the theories first, but looking at the data first. If you begin with the data, you can then try and find theories that satisfy all of the data and not just some of it. Third thing, Luke's lack of M material. Luke's lack of M material is one of the most bizarre of all the arguments against Q. Because of course Luke lacks M material, because if Luke had the M material, it'd be called Q material, right? This is one argument. I can actually remember the moment when I came across it for the first time, and I can remember thinking, well, you know, I'm missing something here, you know. And in the decade or so that I've been reflecting on these things, no, it's more than a decade or so, goodness, 20 years or so, that I've been reflecting on these things, I still cannot fathom out this argument. Insofar as it has any sense at all, the argument seems to be that Luke would have included these M material pieces if he had known them. So we have to say, okay, which bits of M would I have included if I were Luke? And that's always a difficult thing to do, isn't it? To try and imagine yourself into the mindset of a first century writer. But what I do is I say, okay, let's look at the Magi. That's one of the biggest on. Robert Stein's introduction to the Synoptic Problem, big deal about how Luke doesn't include the Magi, Luke's a Gentile, and so on. If I were Luke, would I have included the Magi? Absolutely not. Do you know why not? Luke doesn't like Magi. If you read Acts of the Apostles, and don't just read Luke's Gospel, he's got a big thing about Magi. One of the villains in the book is called Simon Magus. Magus is the singular of Magi. Is Luke really going to... Oh, gosh, I'm getting excited, aren't I? Gosh, I can feel a rant coming on. It's great. No, I should do it all calmly, shouldn't I? But how would you rather I pretended to be all serious and academic? Would you rather have a rant? Yes. Rant, great, okay. Would Luke seriously? Sorry, I could just feel... The thing is, you just feel yourself kind of inhabiting the rant. And would Luke seriously have included a story about Magi right at the beginning of his Gospel when he has a known dislike for Magi? I mean... There are sorcerers in Acts of the Apostles, and they're the worst kind of people you can get. They have to have their books burnt and everything. He's not going to make them his heroes at the beginning of the Gospel. What's Luke going to do? He's going to have some people like some shepherds or something like that, isn't it? Good, solid, Jewish, Hebrew Bible kind of characters. I mean, he's not going to have Magi, is it? I mean, I mean, I don't understand why these people don't actually read the New Testament, because the answer's in the New Testament. I mean, amazing, absolutely amazing. It'd be good if I tried to do rants on the arguments for Q, wouldn't it? I should try doing that. I mean, can you believe Luke wouldn't have messed up Matthew's beautiful Sermon on the Mount? What do these people at Goodacre think? I mean, that'd be fun if I did that, wouldn't it? But anyway, but I don't believe that. There's no conviction in that, is there? Okay, so that's the third one. Right. Fourth one, alternating primitivity, the toughest one of all. I actually think this is probably the best argument for Q. It doesn't rest on a fallacy. It doesn't rest on a value judgment, at least not all the time. And it requires a little bit more care and a little bit more sifting. But I think there's a couple of important things need to be said about this argument. The first of them is that people consistently underestimate the case that Luke is redacting Matthew. Now, the example which I gave earlier on in response to the question was the First Beatitude. Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God, in Luke 6:20, or in Matthew 5:3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Textbook example of greater Lucan primitivity. Every single book you go to will tell you, apart from mine, will tell you that this is a good example of how Matthew has spiritualized the original Q Beatitude. Well, here's what I say. What do we know about Luke? One of his major interests is in the poor. So is he going to say blessed are the poor in spirit, or is he more likely to have blessed are the poor? Well, again and again he has material that looks favourably on the poor. Even more than that, who is the Beatitude addressed to in Luke 6:20? It's addressed to the disciples. Are the disciples in Luke's Gospel the poor? Absolutely they are. When Luke has someone being called, when he has the disciple being called, he always takes care to add to his mark and account, having left everything, they followed Jesus. So the poor as a group is now the disciples. That's Luke's term for the disciples. So if he's going to have Jesus look at the disciples and say something, blessed is someone, blessed is the poor, blessed are the poor. That's exactly what you'd expect Luke's Jesus to say. Moreover, Luke is the gospel that has this kind of eschatological reversal, where this world's values are turned over by the values of the kingdom of God. So Luke doesn't just have blessed are the poor, he also has woe to the rich. Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God, but woe to the rich, because you have received your consolation already. That beatitude and woe summarizes very nicely the plot of one of Luke's most characteristic parables, Luke 16, the rich man and Lazarus, where the poor man goes into Abraham's bosom, he's rewarded, the poor man receives the kingdom of God, and the rich man goes down to Hades, goes to hell, because he has received his consolation already. The wording is actually is kind of reflected in that story. So Luke's the gospel that has stories that big up poor people so that they will receive their reward in the kingdom of heaven, and also tells the rich that they've already received their reward and they've not got anything to look forward to. So would Luke really, is it so implausible that Luke would have redacted blessed are the poor in spirit in Matthew to become blessed are the poor in Luke? I think there's actually a strong case that Luke adjusted the wording of blessed are the poor in spirit. But it's difficult to persuade people of this one. Part of the problem here is that there's an extra text that says blessed are the poor, and it's the Gospel of Thomas. And if people think that the Gospel of Thomas is early and independent, then of course you've got another witness to the earliness of that saying. But I think that Thomas knows Luke, so I don't go for that one. That's the first reason that I'm wary about this alternating primitivity argument. The second reason is you have to be careful about confusing the age of traditions and literary priority. The difficulty is that scholars a lot of the time want everything to be nice and simple and to develop from A to B to C to D, and everything to work in the same way. But sometimes what can happen, and it happens in contemporary life just as it did in antiquity, you might be using a literary source but still be affected by oral traditions that are more primitive than the literary source that you're looking at. So in other words, you might, in redacting Matthew, if you were Luke, have a version of a saying that you know from oral tradition that you prefer. And the thing is, two-source theorists, people that believe in the priority of Mark, very much work with this idea already when they're looking at Luke's use of Mark, because there's whole cases where Luke is using Mark as his literary source, but then what happens is he kind of adjusts the wording according to something more primitive. The best example of this is in Luke's version of the Eucharistic tradition, where Luke is telling the story of the Last Supper, and the wording of the Last Supper story in Luke is much closer to Paul's wording in 1 Corinthians, which is early. So in other words, Luke's got Mark's Gospel, and he adjusts it to a more primitive wording from the tradition that he already knows. Why is it implausible that he would sometimes do that with Matthew? The reason why people don't grasp it is because they too quickly line up literary priority with age of traditions, and the two aren't necessarily the same thing. Just imagine if you were working from a literary account of something, but you also knew an oral version. You could find that you melded the two in your work, right? Sometimes one of the things that I like to look at is Disney adaptations of famous old folktales. If you look at Aladdin, for example, which came out in, 1991? Somewhere around there-ish. If you look at versions of Aladdin that post-date Disney, you'll find that the Disney version often influences the Aladdin, but it hasn't wiped out all other retellings of the Aladdin story. It's just had a strong influence on them. That's what I think it was like when Matthew's Gospel comes along for Luke. It doesn't completely submerge all other understandings, readings of the Jesus tradition for Luke. It influences him, yes, massively, but he still has his other sources, right? Does that make some sort of sense? So that's the sort of argument from alternating primitivity. Now, the danger with all of this stuff is that all of it is in its own way kind of defensive. It's kind of arguing against the arguments against Luke's use of Matthew. So are there any positive arguments for Luke's use of Matthew? Is there more than just that the arguments against it are bad? Well, I think there's a couple of positive arguments you could use as well. First one is minor agreements. If Luke knew Matthew, then he knows Matthew everywhere, right? Not just in the double tradition. So you should be able to look for influence of Matthew in Luke's versions of the triple tradition. In other words, when Luke is copying out of Mark, does he include little reminiscences of Matthew's redaction? And he does, all the way through. Some people have tried to count these minor agreements, places where Luke and Matthew agree against Mark, and they can get into the thousands. There are lots of them. The way E.P. Sanders puts it is there's not a single pericope, there's not a single passage anywhere in the Synoptic Gospels that doesn't feature a minor agreement somewhere between Matthew and Luke against Mark. And some of these are really substantial. One of the most famous is in Mark 14:65, which is Jesus is being beaten up, and they say to him, prophesy. And that's it. In Matthew's Gospel, it's reworked as prophesy, Christ, who is the one who hit you? Then in Luke's Gospel, in 22:64, exactly that same phrase, who is the one who smote you? How does that get into Luke when it's not already in Mark? The way that two-source theorists cope with that, because Luke shouldn't know the little extra Matthean bit, the way that they cope with this, they say, well, perhaps the texts have become corrupted somewhere along the line. And originally, it wasn't there in the text. So I think that's a poor explanation. And it can't be from Q, because Q theorists all say that Q didn't have a passion narrative. So minor agreements like that seem to be one of the real Achilles' heels in the two-source theory. I've already alluded to major agreements, but they're kind of parceled off into their own category called mark-Q overlaps. So, yeah, these major agreements. The major agreements are cases where mark stops being the middle term. Do you remember our key bit, our key data, key piece of data is that Mark is usually the middle term? Well, sometimes he's not. Sometimes it becomes Matthew. And those are cases where it makes good sense that Luke has switched mainly to looking at Matthew rather than Mark. Oh, passion narrative, sorry, is Mark 14 to 16, the narrative of Jesus' crucifixion and trials and that sort of thing. Yeah, I should have defined that. So these major agreements are places where Mark stops being the middle term and Matthew starts being the middle term, and they make good sense on the idea that Luke has switched over to focusing mainly on Matthew and no longer just on Mark. So I think, for what my opinion is worth, that the Q theory makes less strong sense of the data than the alternative that Luke knew Matthew directly. In other words, in the triple tradition where Matthew, Mark and Luke are all present, usually Mark's the middle term, right? But then there are these handful of pericopes where Matthew is the middle term. In other words, where there are very few agreements between Mark and Luke against Matthew. But lots of agreements between Mark and Matthew, lots of agreements between Luke and Matthew, but not between Mark and Luke. So in other words, Matthew takes on the role that Mark usually has. That makes good sense on the grounds that Luke sometimes thinks, oh, I'll prefer Matthew's version. So that's sort of what I mean there, that it takes on that role. Luke almost never is the middle term, which is, I think, significant. Can I just throw in one more thing, by way of analogy, in case, because I realise that with the synoptic problem, some of it can be a little bit difficult to navigate your way around. You start thinking, whoa, am I losing, you know. So let me just illustrate from my own experience. There was one time when I was examining in the University of Birmingham in the UK, and we had two pieces of work that were not identical, but were about 60 or 70% identical. And we looked at these pieces of work, and we said, heck, what's happened here? It was clear that there'd been some copying somewhere. The question is, which one had copied off which one? Or had both of them copied from a hypothetical third source? I was actually in favour of that option. I thought they'd both copied from a hypothetical third source that we couldn't see, and the irony wasn't lost on some of my colleagues that I was arguing for a hypothetical third source. But what we were able to do was to get the two students into separate offices, didn't tell them why we were asking them to come, interviewed them separately from one another, and asked them if they could explain this close work. And luckily for us, one of them confessed and said, yes, I'm sorry, I copied. And the other person said, what? I just lent her my essay so that she could, have a little look at it, not so she could copy it out. I'm going to have a word with her later on. So we knew that it had been direct copying by one of the other. And here's the thing. Unless you've got really, really strong grounds for arguing that two very, very similar documents have been copying from a document that we don't any longer have any access to. Really, I think you have to, in the general flow of things, prefer the theory that has the direct copying. And there's an old philosophical principle called Occams Razor, which says that you shouldn't multiply entities beyond what's necessary. So my feeling is that Q is an attempt to multiply entities beyond what's necessary. The theory of Luke directly using Matthew makes much better sense of the data, in my opinion, than both being independent. Okay, that's our end of our third session on the synoptic problem, and next time we move on to redaction criticism. Brilliant, thank you.
Well, thanks very much for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod, this extended episode. You can find the other two extended episodes on the Synoptic Problem over on podacre.blogspot.com or on Duke's iTunes U, or just Google for the NT Pod, and you can find my regular episodes in those places as well. Usually they're about 10 or 12 minutes of produced content rather than recordings of classes like these, but I'm grateful to all the feedback I've had on these, and I'll certainly consider doing some more in the future, since the feedback feedback does seem to have been really positive. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you soon.